At 75 years old, I made a decision that many people told me sounded almost impossible for a parent to make. I decided to quit worrying about my children's problems. Not to stop loving them. Not to stop caring about their lives. But to stop the constant, exhausting, sleepless worry that had followed me through nearly 5 decades of parenthood. Worry that I had always believed was simply the price of loving my children deeply. My dear friends, I want to tell you what happened after I made this decision, because the results surprised even me. But before I share what happened next, I want to walk you through why I finally reached this breaking point, what worry had actually been costing me for all those years, and how I discovered, quite late in life, that worry and love, though they had always felt identical to me, were actually two entirely different things. If you are a parent who lies awake at night running through your adult children's problems, if you find yourself carrying their struggles as though they were your own, if you have ever wondered whether your constant worry is actually helping them or simply hurting you, I ask you to listen closely today. What I discovered at 75 changed not only my own health and happiness, but ultimately changed my relationship with my children as well, in ways I never anticipated. 50 years of carrying their problems, I want to be honest with you about what worry looked like in my life for nearly 5 decades. From the moment each of my 3 children was born, I began carrying, quietly and constantly, an invisible weight made up entirely of their struggles, their difficulties, their uncertain futures. When they were small, this looked like ordinary parental concern, worrying about their health, their safety, their development. This felt appropriate, even necessary, during those early years. But as my children grew into adults, this pattern of worry did not diminish the way I had always assumed it would. If anything, it intensified. When my son struggled in his marriage during his 30s, I carried that struggle with me constantly, replaying his difficulties in my mind during quiet moments, losing sleep over conflicts that were not mine to resolve. When my daughter faced financial hardship during a difficult period in her career, I found myself calculating and recalculating her situation late into the night, as though my own anxious mental rehearsal might somehow produce a solution that had not yet occurred to her. I want to be honest, this worry did not feel like a burden to me during most of those years. It felt like love. I believed, deeply and without question, that a parent who did not worry about their children's struggles was somehow a less devoted, less caring parent than one who carried this constant concern. I wore my worry almost as a badge of honor, evidence of how deeply I loved my children, even though this worry, if I am honest, rarely produced any actual benefit for them and instead slowly eroded my own health, my own peace, and even my own relationships with the very children I was so anxious about. What worry was actually costing me, I did not fully understand the cost of this pattern until my physician, during a routine visit when I was 73, expressed genuine concern about my elevated blood pressure, my persistent difficulty sleeping, and a general pattern of chronic stress that he believed was significantly affecting my physical health. When he asked me directly what might be causing this ongoing stress, I found myself, almost involuntarily, describing in detail my son's recent career difficulties, my daughter's ongoing health concerns, my youngest's uncertain financial situation. I realized, describing this to him, that I had been carrying these worries so constantly and for so long that I had stopped even recognizing them as a choice. They had simply become the background noise of my entire existence. My physician said something to me that day that I have never forgotten. He asked me plainly whether my constant worry had ever actually solved any of my children's problems. I sat with this question for a long moment, and I realized, honestly, that it had not. Not once, in nearly 5 decades, had my anxious rumination about my children's struggles produced a single practical solution that would not have occurred to me through calmer, more measured thought, or that had not ultimately been solved by my children themselves, through their own efforts and resilience. This realization was uncomfortable, but it was also the beginning of genuine change. I began to understand that my worry, rather than serving my children in any meaningful way, had primarily served to damage my own physical health, disrupt my own sleep, and create a chronic undercurrent of anxiety that touched every part of my life, including, I began to realize, my actual interactions with my children themselves. How worry was damaging my relationships, not just my health. As I examined this pattern more honestly, I began to notice something else troubling. My constant worry was not simply a private, internal burden. It was actively affecting how I interacted with my children, often in ways that strained our relationships rather than strengthening them. When my son called to share news about a work difficulty, my immediate response, shaped by years of anxious habit, was often to project my own worry onto the conversation, asking anxious follow-up questions, offering unsolicited advice born more from my own need to soothe my anxiety than from anything he had actually requested. I began to notice, looking back honestly, that these conversations often left him feeling somewhat managed or subtly criticized, rather than genuinely supported, because my anxious energy inevitably colored how I responded to whatever he shared with me. I also began to notice that my constant worry communicated something to my children that I had never intended. a subtle, underlying message that I did not fully trust their own capability to navigate their own lives. Every anxious question, every unsolicited piece of advice born from my own worry rather than their actual request, quietly suggested that I believed they needed my anxious oversight in order to successfully manage their own adult lives. This message, communicated over and over across many years, I began to realize, may have actually undermined their confidence rather than supporting it, despite my genuine intention to help. The decision, once I fully understood the true cost of my worry, both to my own health and to the quality of my relationships with my children, I made a deliberate decision. I decided, at 75 years old, that I would no longer allow worry to occupy the space in my mind and heart that had, for decades, been consumed by anxious rumination about my children's problems. I want to be clear about what this decision actually meant, because I do not want you to misunderstand it as indifference or emotional withdrawal from my children's lives. Quitting worry did not mean I stopped caring about my children's struggles. It meant I stopped the specific pattern of anxious, repetitive, unproductive mental rehearsal that had characterized my relationship to their difficulties for nearly 5 decades. I decided to replace this pattern with something entirely different, genuine care, expressed through calm presence and appropriate support, without the constant undercurrent of anxious rumination that had never actually served anyone, including myself. How I actually stopped worrying. The practical shift. I want to walk you through exactly how I began to make this shift, because I understand that simply deciding to stop worrying, without a genuine practical approach, rarely produces lasting change. Worry, particularly worry practiced for decades, becomes deeply habitual, and habits require deliberate, practical strategies to genuinely shift. The first practical shift I made was learning to distinguish between productive concern and unproductive rumination. When I learned about a difficulty in one of my children's lives, I began asking myself a simple question: is there something specific and practical I can offer right now, whether that is a particular piece of advice they have actually requested, or a specific form of support within my genuine capacity to provide? If the answer was yes, I would offer that specific support once, calmly, and then release the matter from my ongoing mental attention. If the answer was no, if there was genuinely nothing productive I could offer in that moment, I made a deliberate practice of releasing the matter from my mind entirely, rather than allowing it to occupy hours of anxious, unproductive rehearsal. The second practical shift involved changing how I responded during actual conversations with my children about their struggles. Rather than immediately projecting my own anxiety through anxious questions or unsolicited advice, I began practicing simply listening, calmly and fully, without inserting my own worry into the conversation. I discovered that this calm, non-anxious presence was often far more genuinely supportive to my children than my previous pattern of anxious engagement, because it allowed them to process their own difficulties without simultaneously managing my emotional reaction to those difficulties. The third practical shift, and perhaps the most difficult, involved developing genuine trust in my children's own capability to navigate their own lives. I began deliberately reminding myself, particularly during moments when old anxious patterns arose, that my children were capable adults who had successfully navigated countless difficulties throughout their lives, often without my direct intervention, and that my anxious worry was not actually a necessary ingredient in their eventual success. This shift required me to release a belief I had carried for decades, that my worry somehow served a protective function in their lives, and to replace it with genuine confidence in their own resilience and capability. The specific moment everything began to shift. I want to share with you a specific moment that illustrated, clearly, how this new practice actually worked in real life. Several months after I began this deliberate shift, my daughter called to share that she was facing a significant financial difficulty related to an unexpected medical expense. In the past, this news would have triggered weeks of anxious rumination, sleepless nights calculating and recalculating her financial situation, anxious phone calls checking in repeatedly about her progress. Instead, I listened calmly to what she shared, and I asked her directly whether there was something specific I could help with, whether financially or otherwise. She explained that she and her husband had already developed a workable plan to manage the situation, and that she was primarily calling simply to share what was happening in her life, not necessarily seeking intervention. I offered my genuine support, expressed my confidence in her ability to navigate the situation, and then, deliberately, I released the matter from my ongoing attention. I want to be honest, releasing this worry required genuine, deliberate practice in those early days. Old thought patterns would occasionally surface, anxious thoughts about her situation arising unbidden during quiet moments. But each time this happened, I would consciously remind myself of my new practice, gently redirecting my attention away from unproductive rumination and back toward my own present life. Over the following weeks, I noticed something remarkable. My daughter successfully navigated her financial difficulty entirely on her own, and when she called weeks later to share that the matter had been fully resolved, there was a genuine pride and confidence in her voice, a confidence I believe may have been somewhat undermined had I inserted my own anxious oversight into her process, the way I likely would have in earlier years. What happened next? The results I did not expect. I promised you at the beginning of this message that I would share what happened after I made this significant shift, and I want to be honest with you about the results, both the ones I anticipated and the ones that genuinely surprised me. The most immediate change was in my own physical health. Within several months of releasing my chronic pattern of worry, my sleep improved dramatically. My blood pressure, which had concerned my physician for years, began to stabilize significantly. I found myself with genuine energy and mental clarity that I had not experienced in decades, energy that I had not realized was being constantly depleted by years of anxious rumination about problems that were never actually mine to solve. The second change, one I did not fully anticipate, involved the quality of my actual conversations with my children. Freed from my own anxious agenda, I found myself genuinely curious about their lives in a new way, asking questions born from authentic interest rather than anxious need for reassurance. My children, in turn, began sharing more openly with me, I believe because they sensed that I was no longer approaching their difficulties with an anxious need to manage or fix their circumstances. Our conversations became genuinely richer, filled with authentic connection rather than my own projected worry. The third change, perhaps the most surprising to me, involved my children's own confidence and capability. I began to notice, over the following 2 years, that my children seemed to navigate their own difficulties with greater independence and confidence than they had during the decades when my constant worry had been a background presence in nearly every interaction we shared. I do not believe this was coincidental. I believe that my previous pattern of anxious worry, however well-intentioned, had been quietly communicating a lack of confidence in their capability, and that releasing this pattern allowed them the genuine space to develop and demonstrate confidence in themselves. Addressing the fear that quitting worry means you don't care. I know some of you listening today may be wondering whether releasing this pattern of worry means becoming a less caring, less devoted parent. I understand this concern deeply, because I carried this exact fear myself for many years before finally making the shift. I want to address it honestly. Worry and genuine care, I have come to understand clearly, are not actually the same thing, despite how similar they may feel from the inside. Genuine care involves being present, being supportive when support is genuinely needed and requested, and maintaining authentic interest in your children's lives. Worry, by contrast, involves anxious mental rehearsal of problems that are not currently solvable through your continued rumination, a pattern that primarily serves to deplete your own well-being while providing little genuine benefit to the person you are worried about. I want you to consider something important. A parent who is chronically anxious, sleep-deprived, and depleted from decades of worry is not actually in a stronger position to genuinely support their children during moments when support is truly needed. A parent who has protected their own health and peace, releasing unproductive worry while remaining genuinely available and supportive when authentic need arises, is often in a far stronger position to provide meaningful help precisely when it matters most. The difference between worry and prayer or genuine concern. I want to address something that some of you may be considering, particularly if faith plays an important role in your life. There is an important difference between worry, which is anxious, repetitive, and unproductive, and genuine concern expressed through intentional prayer, reflection, or thoughtful consideration of how to be helpful. I still think about my children's lives with genuine love and interest. I still consider, thoughtfully, how I might be helpful during genuine moments of need. What I have released is specifically the anxious, repetitive rumination that provided no genuine benefit while significantly depleting my own health and peace. If prayer or reflective concern is meaningful to you, I encourage you to distinguish this practice clearly from anxious worry. Prayer, offered calmly and then released, is quite different from anxious rumination that occupies your mind for hours without any genuine resolution. Learning this distinction may help you maintain whatever spiritual practices are meaningful to you, while still releasing the specific pattern of unproductive worry that I am describing today. What about genuine emergencies? I want to address honestly what this practice looks like during genuine emergencies, because I do not want to suggest that releasing chronic worry means becoming detached during moments of authentic crisis. When my son experienced a serious health scare 2 years ago, I want to be honest that I felt genuine concern, genuine fear, genuine urgency to be present and helpful. This is different from chronic, everyday worry about ordinary life difficulties. During genuine emergencies, I remain fully present, fully engaged, and genuinely supportive in whatever practical ways are needed. What I have released is the constant, low-grade anxious rumination about ordinary, everyday struggles that are not genuine emergencies, but rather the normal difficulties that accompany any adult life. Learning to distinguish between genuine emergencies, which deserve full presence and appropriate concern, and ordinary life difficulties, which do not require constant anxious rumination, has been an important part of this practice. My final words to you, my dear friends: if you have spent decades carrying your children's problems as though they were your own, losing sleep, damaging your own health, and quietly undermining your children's confidence through constant anxious worry, I want you to know that there is another way to love them, a way that may actually serve both your own well-being and their genuine growth far better than the pattern you may currently be living within. Your children, like mine, are almost certainly more capable than your worry has been giving them credit for. Your health, your peace, and your remaining years deserve protection from the chronic depletion that unproductive worry inevitably produces. And genuine love for your children does not require constant anxious rumination about their struggles. It requires calm presence, genuine support when authentically needed, and enough trust in their own capability to allow them the space to navigate their own lives, just as you once navigated your own difficulties at their age. Thank you so much for spending this time with me today. If these words resonated with you, I hope you will begin, even in small ways, distinguishing between genuine, productive concern and the anxious, repetitive worry that has likely been depleting you for far longer than you may have realized. Your children's problems are theirs to navigate. Your peace, your health, and your remaining years are yours to protect. This has been Life Mastery 60+. Until next time, release what is not yours to carry, protect your own peace, and remember that trusting the people you love is often the deepest form of love you can offer them.